We are what we are from, both here and before this that we have become. The essence of our nature and the origin are one. Through essence conceived, paradox begotten, identity formed and origin forgotten, dismembered from memory, remember, remember. I'm not sure how to tell this story, the origins of consciousness. I feel that it may be easier to begin by explaining that there is a pre-material infrastructure from which human consciousness manifests itself in our material world. We've adopted terms in our colloquial lexicon like matrix of consciousness, structure of thought, belief systems, frame of mind, thought forms, thought patterns, and many other expressions to describe human consciousness structurally. In observing the structures of the world that humans have built, we will notice precise patterns that reflect the form of consciousness that built them. This infrastructure of human consciousness is in fact universal. It is shared throughout the world despite our varying nationalities, ethnicities, cultures, or our family circumstances. Not only does the infrastructure of consciousness shape our external world, but it also determines our place in it by how our personal identities have been formed within the context of the greater infrastructure itself. As the old saying goes, as within, as without. So what I am attempting to relay is that we form our identities in life from a pre-existing mold, a framework that has existed from the beginning of time and space. Out of this framework, or infrastructure, we build our homes, our roads, our cities, our tools, our governments, and our relationships. This infrastructure is also responsible for all human suffering, the suffering we have inflicted on ourselves, each other, and our environment. Everybody knows that something's wrong. The reason why we have not been able to evolve ourselves out of this is that all options for change have been derived from within the infrastructure itself. You can't think your way out of a problem that was created by thought. In other words, the solutions that we have been provided on how to change our lives, how to think better, how to change unwanted behaviors, get out of cycles of abuse, change our societies for the better, end homelessness, hunger, war, sexual violence, and bring the peace we cry out for. All of these solutions, all of these options, have only helped to sustain the very way things are. This is because they originate out of human consciousness, out of an infrastructure that exists only to sustain its existence. I must let you know that I must use this infrastructure to describe the infrastructure, how it formed, how it works, and how to end it. This process of explaining is going to be long and at times complicated. I will do my best to simplify it where I can. However, I want you to know that what I'm attempting to describe is a living, functioning process whose movements, expressions, and manifestations are all interdependent. Yet, if we can understand the simplicity of its origins, then we can understand how everything became so confusing. There is a way to radically and forever change the way we experience life, to live without suffering, in love, in beauty, and in harmony with creation itself. When we understand how this infrastructure works within our own lives and within the human world as a whole, we will then be able to realize the answer we have searched for our whole lives and yet known from the beginning of time. An answer, in a word, more misunderstood than any other: love. In the following, I will introduce three main characters. They are the primary elements of consciousness. This is where the story begins, with them. I need to explain their qualities before I introduce their relationship. So please understand that as I speak about and describe to you who they are, their essential nature will unfold through their interactions with each other from the beginning of space and time, shaping what we know today as consciousness itself. Also, it is important to remember that the words I use are only the best that I have discovered to describe them, and there are, no doubt, many more that can be attributed to them. Shaped from breath and tongue, spoken, shouted, cried, and sung, dressed for the occasion, words are strung in unison. Thread through by intention, they fabricate being and clothe expression in suitable fashion, though they cannot lay bare the nakedness of being that is unconditional love. Translating that which whose very essence sprung forth all perceivable elements, forces, and their various states of dynamism is unfathomable. The problem is not allotted to language alone, with its innate inadequacies, its inability to reflect the essence of experience, without the inevitable conflicts that arise when you are mediated and represented poorly by an incompetent ambassador. Let us acknowledge, once again, that words enclosing meaning are only metaphors for being, the being of existence in timeless presence, present as a gift. There is, however, a pre-existing circumstance that hinders our ability to experience, communicate, and translate that which is unconditional with language. Thus, though the limitations of language are innately involved in our conflicts, they are neither causal nor ultimately important here at this time. Unconditional love is the preeminent elemental force, the metaphysical ground for existence, and the quintessence of the human spirit. Yet to speak upon it conceives only paradox, for what is infinite becomes finite within the clenching fist of thought. That which is without conditions contains perceivable qualities, and yet transcends them. It is as though what we would perceive as tangible fails to behold the majesty of such a bountiful infinitude. With undulations of intangible beingness, showering acceptance in a cosmic dance, unfolding in soft petals of bliss, the notion for capturing its meaning for translation has occurred to all who have rested their cheek upon the pregnant belly of creation and felt the soft kicking of their own potent potential. Qualitatively, its existence is and was present before there was what there now is, and still is now that what is came to be. Moreover, within the existential state of being unconditional love, the absolute experiences continuous abundance, like a bountiful dance of fulfillment, because there is no separation spatially or temporally. There is no perception of lacking, missing, or needing anything. Desire as we know it today would be as if in a prenatal state, inseparable from both its nourishment and its environment. Therefore, before desire could perceive a need, it exists as undifferentiated potential in a fluid state of unconditional acceptance, negating any primordial need for fulfillment or emergence. Unconditional love may be conceived qualitatively as representing in part a pre-desirous state. For what need could desire plead if before the please there was already sure? The two as one, wed as in the word that's read, pleasure. From this state of pre-desire, actions are performed as an extension of being rather than for the purpose of becoming or acquiring. In this way, They are not actions at all, but rather extemporaneous expressions of beingness embracing itself. Unconditional love, synonymous with the absolute, the preeminent source of all that is by its very nature unconditionally inclusive. Herein, if only for the sake of convenience, this essential quality intrinsic only to unconditional love shall occasionally be referred to as absolute inclusivity. Furthermore, it is important to note the pre-temporal and pre-spatial nature of the absolute, because the essence of its beingness is not centralized or localized in relation to any perceived separation of itself with that which it is not. Any perceived object within itself and the subsequent space between such an object and another is indivisible, non-existent. Therefore, mobility is omnidirectional, while simultaneously being omnipresent. Thus, through omnipresence, it is omniscient, and through omniscience, it is omnipotent. That which whose very essence is unconditionally inclusive contains no opposite, as some have called it, one without a second. That is to say that being inclusive of all realities as representations of itself, unconditional love containing the essential quality of absolute inclusivity does not differentiate itself into duality, bifurcate its beingness, or distinguish itself through dichotomy. The vastness of its all-inclusive acceptance includes even that which opposes it, denies it, rejects it, or is ignorant of it. This is the origin of creation itself. There are two types of spatial experience we all share. The first is the physical space of our earthly existence, and within it we have physical time. Physical space and time play only a small part in the existence of life, like a pen and ink play only a small part in the words you write. There is, however, a second type of space and time we all share. This second type of space-time is more dynamic and far-reaching than that of physical space and time. For it precedes them, it lives, and it functions within them. This second type of space-time is actually the prematerial infrastructure of our personal and collective identities. I wanted to take a moment and introduce a new word that describes the second and more fundamental space-time experience: psychospatial temporality. It refers to our inner experience within ourselves and how we move through our minds in our own psychological space and psychological time. As I'll be going into this much deeper in the future, let me say for now that psychospatial temporality, or psychological space-time, shares similar features to that of physical space and time because it was created at the beginning of space and time as we know it. Lastly, psychospatial temporality refers to the fully matured and fully functional infrastructure of consciousness. So before I can go into this further and describe it in its maturity, let's continue with the introduction of our second character in this story, the antithetical force. Now, to put it simply, the antithetical force is the psychological space between both us and our memories, our thoughts, and between us and our perception of other people, places, and things in the external world. In other words, the antithetical force is psychospatiality itself. It is the emptiness inside us, the cause of the feeling of being disconnected, not heard, and not seen for who you feel you truly are. It is the cause of all suffering, conflict, and conditioning of personal and collective identity. Metaphysically speaking, the antithetical force is an essential elemental force that is pre-material in location and possesses the primary quality of absolute exclusivity. That is to say, that its primary essence is located on a frequency of consciousness higher than that of matter, behind material formation, acting through matter, reforming matter into manifestation as the material world we have created. Our homes, towns, cities, and countries are collectively its material body. Our laws, systems of government and education, our social stratifications, forms of entertainment, our belief systems, religions, and science itself, all that is its mind in operation within its body, and we are its source of sustenance. The most basic notion of subject-object duality, the notion that I am separate from you and you from me, that we are separate from our environment, this most basic concept, intrinsic to all functions of human existence, is the cornerstone of the infrastructure of consciousness. Unlike unconditional love, with its primary quality of absolute inclusivity, which itself has no opposite, the antithetical force, with its essential elemental quality of absolute exclusivity, is the cause of all opposition. Its very nature is the force of resistance one feels when confronting their own thoughts and subsequent feelings. It is the resistance to presence, the same resistance that allows us individuality and the endless choices for false fulfillment in people, places, and things outside of ourselves. Choices that never bring true fulfillment, joy, or anything more than temporary distractions from the present moment. A present moment filled with thoughts, feelings, relationships, and experiences imbued with conflict, that owe their very cause to the same thing that provides them with more options, more choices. The antithetical force, psychospatiality. The same thing that divides us subsequently unites us divisively. The antithetical force created the very notion of oneself as different from that which is not oneself, and thus this notion, this belief of difference, is experienced within us as the psychological space between us and our thoughts, between us and our perception of the world. Therefore, psychospatiality is at its root absolute exclusivity. The space must be empty and exclude all things in order to exist, and consequently, the same space must be empty for us as isolated individuals to exist. The antithetical force, as psychospatiality in other words, is unable to exist as anything other than itself. It operates, functions, and enacts its primary agenda, which, inseparable from its very essence, is to fragment the unified continuum of what has been called God, Spirit, unconditional love, the Absolute, etc., into an infinite mosaic of shattered shards, defiling creation in its mocking reformation. The perversion of reality occurs through qualitative distinctions of identity that divide the once unified spiritual essence in opposition to itself, through the fragmentation of undifferentiated beingness into being someone, something, somewhere, somehow. In order for it to exist, it must enact its essential nature, its modus operandi, through the frequency of human consciousness via the human spirit, and create an environment internally and externally where form reflects the function of the antithetical force's existential purpose. Therefore, it is responsible for the form and function of energetic dynamics in all human relations, including organized social structures, institutions, our utilities and tools, the human habitats we build by them, and the belief systems that operate within them. To be clear, it dominates the world at the level of human self-consciousness, from which through us it creates an environment out of its own image, for no other reason than to implement its primary agenda and existential purpose. However, in order that it succeeds and continues to thrive in the place of human spirit at the throne of consciousness, we must remain its source of sustenance and livelihood through the sacrificial offerings of emotional, physical, and psychological suffering we endure and inflict upon others, both in its multitude of names and under its pseudo-godlike rule. So again, to be clear, the antithetical force establishes conditionality first at the level of human consciousness acting within form. It replaces our unconditional nature with conditionality, altering our original spiritual vibrational frequency, therefore altering the dimensions of our manifest possibility from the absolute inclusivity of unconditional love into what we know as self or personal identity. Once establishing itself upon the throne of human consciousness, it sets about creating a distinct identity within the human form it occupies. Simultaneously, while creating self-ideation, self-concept, and identity as an individual, the antithetical force is shaping the individual to serve as a functioning unit within the medium of its own essence, within the world it shaped, the world we know collectively as humanity. Just as there are two types of space, physical space and psychological space, there are two types of time. Just as spin and rotation are qualities of physical time, spin and rotation play a part in psychological time, or as I may refer to it, psychotemporality. The antithetical force, synonymous with psychospatiality, or psychological space, is responsible for the empty boundaries that appear between us and our thoughts and the perception of a self in isolation to other selves in the external material world. The antithetical force functions interdependently with psychotemporality, psychological time, and it is not any more autonomous than physical space is from physical time. The movement through the infrastructure of consciousness, through our own inner world of thoughts, feelings, and memories, the movement is governed by both psychospatiality and psychotemporality. The boundaries defining difference within our minds and the time those boundaries were erected combine to create psychological space-time. The physical time when we experience something that forever shaped our notion of the world, who we are, and our place in it. The shape that shapes our notion of ourselves and the world is the space that divides us from it externally and internally. This shape is psychospatiality. The notion of ourselves is shaped and defined within that space, separated from other notions of ourself and the world in psychological time. Across the divide of psychological space, we see or sense an image in our minds of a thought, of a memory, of an event. Across that divide, psychological space defines a moment in psychological time. All that seems so full in thought, its essence, before it was defined in our minds, given a name, an identity, and trapped as such in psychological time. What this is came from the source of all that is, to become the source of nourishment and sustenance for the antithetical force. What this is, that's trapped in time, inside our memories, is what we have come to call desire. Next to love, the second most misunderstood experience is desire. The book World Scripture, a comparative anthology of sacred texts by the International Religious Foundation, copyright 1991, and published by Paragon House Publishers, states, "Every major religion recognizes that suffering and evil are caused by excessive desires and desires directed towards a selfish purpose. And yet I contend that every major religion is wrong. Desire has received the lion's share of blame and responsibility for the suffering of humanity from farther back in time than most can remember. It is not desire, but that which directs desire. It is not desire, but that which defines it, and its options, its choices, its avenues for fulfillment. That which conditions the essence of desire to seek that which only denies it what it really wants, what it really needs. It is that which, in so defining it, cuts it off from its origin and trains it to want things that only help redefine the boundaries of its own identity, giving life to the limitations, to the boundaries, and the space between all things and itself, thus, then wanting what is outside of itself. The essence and the origin of all desire is unconditional love. In fact, desire is unconditional love trapped within the spatial confines of identity, within psycho-temporality, surrounded by the emptiness of psychospatiality, trapped in time, isolated and surrounded by the empty spaces within our minds. The essence of all thought is desire. The impetus for all actions is desire. All the suffering that has been attributed to desire has made desire appear as the attributes that define desire. The attributes that lay blame upon desire and demand its limitation are sustained by the expression of desire's perversion as it acts out within the confines of the limitations set forth by the attributes themselves. In other words, it has never been desire that has caused us all this suffering. It has been that which programmed desire to seek fulfillment in that which will only justify the need to limit desire and justify the judgments upon it by having desire programmed to run through a maze like a rat after cheese. A maze in our minds whose path has been defined by the walls of identity and the spaces in between. This is the function of the antithetical force: to entrap unconditional love within the isolation of identity, thus transforming unconditional love into desire and directing desire towards choices for fulfillment that justify, sustain, and support the infrastructure of consciousness, the body of the antithetical force. As we try to grasp and describe the infinite nature of our universe, the vastness of space, and its origin in time, we use our minds, our thoughts, emotions, and our languages to convey these perceptions. It seems quite natural. But why do we use the finite to experience and define the infinite? Does the process of naming and isolating one piece of the whole ever allow us to know the whole, or just a whole lot of pieces?
A flower consists of the following parts: the stamen, which consists of the anther and the filament; the pistil, which consists of the stigma, the style, and the ovary; the petal, the ovules, the sepal, and the pedicel, a typical flower.
But as we all know, the whole is more than merely the sum of its parts. The infinite nature, the absolute, that cannot be named, gave rise to the infinite nature of naming things. Naming, as a process of thought and language, is as infinite as that which we give names to. We seem to expand our identities through this process of naming as we explore our consciousness and the physical universe we live in. In fact, the form of our identities was informed this way, and the function of our identities reflects these forms. So the forms of our thoughts reflect their function, to provide us our identity. A thought form, a single unit within the body of thought, functions much in the same way that a word functions within the body of a language. If we can ascribe a material form, a dimensionality to a word, we will see that a single word has distinct definition. Now, if that definition was a spatial definition, meaning that what that word describes as a person, place, thing, action, or attribute of it within space and time, does so by isolating one thing from another. So, the exterior spatial definition of a word is the difference in meaning from one thing to another. And yet words also contain their own inner spatial definition, if you will. Every word, whether spoken or written, has a beginning and an end. From the beginning of a word to its end, therein is its definition. Its form has a distinct definition. But what is it defining? Well, as we all know, it defines its meaning, and its meaning is found within the spatial confines of its definition. So, both meaning and defining are the form and function of words in language. Neither can exist without the other. A thought form within the body of thought informs us in meaning. However, no one word or thought can ever capture the entirety of our infinite nature, and so, like words, we become trapped within them as their meaning, supporting their existence in our struggle to break free from the limitations of our identities. All of our conflicts arise from either being wrongfully identified or protecting ourselves within such identities. So again, what I'm attempting to describe here is the origin and components of identity as its form functions within a greater infrastructure of our collective human consciousness. The infinite fluid continuity of the absolute, unconditional love, is divided by the force of exclusion, absolute exclusivity, an empty void of spatial separation that sets in motion the material creation of the universe in the prematerial forms of consciousness as we know it. Where once being preceded becoming, all became in an act of cataclysmic division, where from one, between itself, within itself, a space in place where it was not. This is the origin of paradox, the paradox of the infinite, formed in and informed by thought. The antithetical force seems most related to the theory of dark energy in astrophysics, the cause for the exponential expansion of the universe. Before the essence of undifferentiated being became, that part of itself that was to become separated from itself knew no experience of need, living in a pre-spatial, pre-temporal continuum of unconditional love, where fulfillment was preeminent through the essential vibratory abundance of love embracing love with infinite arms of acceptance. Now, having fragmented, there is an instantaneous shock of awakening from a dimension of being, awareness, and bliss to a pre-conscious realization of difference. This event signifies the initial primordial dimensional descent into consciousness and the existential origins of reality as we perceive it. Coupled simultaneously with the shocking realization of difference are the birth of desire and the material force of gravity. Herein, both gravity and magnetism are the measurable fields of desire functioning in the material universe. The essential expansive quality of its vibration, having for the first time been denied the ability to exist in its natural state as an unbroken continuum of fulfillment, reverberates upon contact with the force of antithesis, the prematerial, pre-spatial void of its newly defined exclusion in an explosion of what would be considered the birth of emotion as we know it. Subsequently, within the explosion of emotion's origin, this now separated force reacts in a recoiling reverberation that reverses the intrinsically expansive frequency of its initial state to movements of polarized opposites, comparable to a centrifugal and centripetal force, as well as attraction and repulsion. The moment in which this reversal of vibratory frequency occurs brings into existence not only polarity, but also the precursor for the recognition of duality, through the primordial coalescence of self-ideation, which later results in a fixed structure of self-concepts, known commonly as ego. To be clear, The reversal of this essence from one of infinite fulfillment into that of forever longing is due to the prematerial and immaterial space that cuts it off from its origin, thus dividing the unbroken continuity of its beingness into an isolation from which its innately undivided essence meets division for the first time. Then, in an explosion, in a shock of primordial emotion, it reverberates back outward and then in upon itself, having never before known limits upon its being, and therefore having never experienced lacking, and having for the first time experienced isolation from itself as an emerging self. In its newly forming preconscious identity, it is awakened as the longing to return to the essence of its natural state of being. This longing is the reversal of its vibrational essence, creating a vibrational polarity where there was once only singularity. We have come to know this existential vibration as the quality in consciousness we call desire. Desire, originating here at the beginning of spatial temporal existence and despite all its manifestations throughout time, seeks the return of itself to itself. That is the essence within the movement of desire. At its purest, unconditioned vibration, all desire seeks the return to the unconditionally loving arms of what it has and what we have, conceptually referred to as God, desire's very origin, its true self, and receive the answer to the only question it ever asks. Physical time began like space, differentiation, multiplicity, conditionality, quality, meaning, and the rest of it, the moment desire was born. Desire birthed into distinction the moment its vibratory essence first experienced the conditions upon its acceptability, upon its essence, unconditional love. This initial denial of its rightful qualitative essence occurred upon impact with the immaterial form of conditional love itself, that is, the antithetical force. The impact of the two forces simultaneously erupted in an explosion, which both brought to life the antithetical force's immaterial dimensional body, thought, and with it the sole source of its life, the soul and sustenance of its functioning purpose, desire. From the perspective of the antithetical force, this explosion was the orgasm of conditional love that brought it into existence, that gave it life. From the perspective of desire, it was an unimaginable horror, completely opposite from the bliss of unconditional love, fulfillment, and being it had previously experienced in the union of unconditional love. Again, this initial explosion was what we would later become to know experientially as emotion. The fate of desire was sealed the moment of its emotive impact, as the explosive discharge of emotion awoke the antithetical force from a state of pure potentiality into actuality. Simultaneously, upon its awakening, the antithetical force enveloped the God essence as it was undergoing its vibratory transformation into a separate force that was to become desire. Acting not through its own volition, the antithetical force received its embodiment as the God essence of desire encountered the conditions upon its vibratory being in an explosion of primordial emotion. This explosion, the response and reaction, is the outcome of desire receiving conditions upon its fulfillment, conditions that define the amount of acceptance it can receive as it reaches out towards unconditional love. As the gravitational waves of desire rebound off the pre-dimensional emptiness of the antithetical force, in the first explosion of emotion, and cosmologically known as the Big Bang, desire had nowhere else to go but outward, away, in all directions. The combination of the violent intensity of this emotive explosion and the immeasurable speed of the gravitational waves of desire being sent outward stimulated the arousal and awakening of the antithetical force as the velocity and gravitational waves of desire pulled the pre-dimensional body of psychospatiality, that is, the body of the antithetical force. It pulled it into existence. For as the waves moved outward from the explosion upon the surface of conditional love that divided them from their origin, the pre-dimensional space of the antithetical force was pulled into dimensionality by the vacuum-like space created by the velocity of desire's gravity as it left moving outwardly. Simultaneously, as dimensionality was being pulled into being, the outward moving waves of desire encountered increasing limits upon its movement as it came into contact with the new spatial definitions of its burgeoning existence. As the body of the antithetical force was being pulled into existence into more dimensions of psychospatiality, the waves of desire were simultaneously rebounding off new dimensions it encountered, not knowing that its own repulsion was pulling in dimensions around it as attraction acted out while hidden as the unseen polarity of repulsion, until its outward movement was no longer possible and the spatial definitions finally enclosed it. The first enclosure of the waves of desire represents the origin of consciousness in a pre-conscious state. It is at this moment, within the confines of this first spatial realm of difference and isolation, that time begins as a factor in consciousness. For what is to transpire solidifies personal identity within the three-dimensional space of difference that is isolated from the paradimensional origins of unconditional love, the Absolute. Having no more outward mobility, the now centripetally introverted direction of the God essence of desire, in its initial polarized reversal, drew with it the antithetical force from potentiality into three-dimensional existence. As the dimensional formation of the antithetical force was forming its embodiment, dimensions of space, that are, its body, were unfolding in tandem from the state of pure potentiality and being drawn in an ever-increasing enclosure around the reversed centripetal introversion of God essence. This event completed the moment the final third spatial dimension enveloped the God essence, thus leading to the collapse of desire's vibration into its new center within three-dimensional space. This collapse defined the mobility of physical bodies in space and our minds in psychospatial temporality. Up, down, left, right, inner, outer, introversion, extroversion, centripetal moving towards a center and centrifugal moving away from the center, as well as all forms of polarity we would later come to know, such as gender stereotypes, sexuality, politics, religion, metaphysics, racial stereotypes, and all the rest of polarity, including those in scientific terminology. Now, as the spatial dimensions enclose and confine the vibratory essence of being in self-conception, freedom of mobility becomes equally restricted to the spatial definition therein. With the loss of its innate expansiveness, the rippling waves of desire's awareness reverse in a recoil of forced introversion. The centripetal reverberation then condenses into a centralized point of primordial identity, where the gravitational waves of desire collapse in upon themselves. This center of identity marks a point equidistant in radius to its defined borders. The distance between the self and the limits upon it are not only measured spatially, but also through the conditions on love, desire's true essence, that the spatial confines represent. For it is the spatial confines of identity that are equivalent with the range of mobility, the amount of acceptance, and the volume of love innately allowable within identity, and thus the amount of fulfillment accessible within the boundaries that define the essence of self, that is, desire. It is, in fact, these very spatial boundaries, this limited range of acceptance within the three-dimensional space enclosing desire, that prevents it from moving outward to find its origin, thus causing it to collapse inward as the last resort for fulfillment and acceptance it so desperately needs. Herein, the inner spatial polarity of the outward boundaries of identity is the center from which the oscillations of centripetally introverted waves converge upon. This center later becomes the center of the self, the core of one unit of self-identity, from where the gravitational fields of desire radiates. It is at this point, when desire has become isolated under pressure to increase its density by limiting its natural expansive state and confining it in a limited space, that desire becomes a body or a unit of self-ideation with a gravity that holds the self-concept together. The measurement of density within the centralized convergence is the polar equivalent of the force of restriction and restraint binding the self within. That is to say that the degree of restriction felt by the self is equal to the force restricting it. Inwardly, the length equidistant from the outer polarity to the center of the self, a distance of condensing introversion, at which point no further wave convergence is possible, having reached the inward polar extreme, where the wave density and mass of identity converge on the threshold of a pre-conscious singularity, the collapsing waves of desire tear through the fabric of psychological space, opening a black hole into a newly undefinable and unexplored region of consciousness. Having then been enclosed within the limits of psychospatiality, the infinite nature of desire, having originated from the Absolute, is as uncontainable within the infrastructure of thought as God is. It then collapses inward in its pre-conscious state, escaping under the pressure of false identity through a black hole into what we now call the unconscious. The physical structures that humans have built throughout the world and the fundamental drive that operates within our societies to keep the system and its infrastructure alive is a direct product of our collective consciousness. Everywhere you travel on Earth, you see two fundamental shapes that provide the form and the function to our societies: the circle and the square. You need only to look around you, in the room you're in, and as you go about your life out in the world. What you may begin to notice is that the form that provides structure to our societies is the square, and in 3 dimensions, the cube. From bricks to buildings and city grids, walls to doors, windows, paper, books, engine blocks and automobiles, televisions, computers, the list is endless. The square is the fundamental shape that gives form and holds our human societies within the rigid binds of psychological space and psychological time. But more on this later. Also, you may notice that nearly everything that moves within our human-made world uses the movement of the circle, sphere, cylinder, or tube to provide us mobility within this structure. It is interesting to note that combustion engines within an engine block begins with an explosion of fuel within a confined space to push a cylinder back and forth within a vehicle whose basic shape is a cube on circular tires down square avenues through endless city grids on a large sphere in space. Square keys and circular locks on square doors hang on hinges and open via doorknobs from twisting wrists. Not even a roll of tape can escape the circle and the square. And why is it that we have chosen the cube and the sphere to represent our time and presence here? It is because this infrastructure was built from consciousness. But as of yet, we have not allowed ourselves to see our responsibility. At some time in our lives, we have all looked outside ourselves and felt that we have been a slave within a system that seems so overwhelmingly rigid and unchanging, unrelenting and unforgiving, a system that takes from us to feed itself, and in return offers us only options and choices that benefit itself, teasing our hope with enough to keep us alive. We may have also felt at some time restricted by our roles and relationships, by our titles, our identities, or even by our names. These types of experiences are a dynamic relationship of interdependence between the rigidity of our physical infrastructure and the infrastructure of our collective consciousness. From this infrastructure of consciousness, we have built a physical representation of ourselves, an extension of our inner world into physical reality. Herein is the repetition of history, the futility of outward revolutions in long-term change, the stratification of wealth, all forms of discrimination, social unrest, religious hypocrisy, and the chemical destruction of the earth. All of this bleeding of life can be simply reduced, not to human nature, but rather a false form of identity, an infrastructure of consciousness we are born into, an infrastructure that blankets the world from within our minds and rebuilds itself in matter out of its own image. Whether we are speaking biologically, cosmologically, religiously, or metaphysically, from one always comes two. A cell divides, the Big Bang boomed, and the one divided into many. Though this apparent division is a perceived phenomenon, what is the space that divides one into two and two into many? What is the space of perceived difference between objects in space? Is this perception of spatial difference real, or is our perception of outer spatial difference caused by a type of space that divides us internally within our minds? Let us begin with a different, less compartmentalized view of reality, shall we? Let's fill the space that divides us physically, spiritually, and scientifically from the concepts that scientifically minded people created from their own consciousness. a consciousness that is not ultimately different from yours or mine, and I should add, a consciousness that is not objective in any way whatsoever. Again, the origin of such scientific concepts arose from human consciousness, right? So, if the origin of scientific terminology shares the same consciousness as human consciousness, then we can see that the space that divides the studies of, say, medicine from psychology, and from psychology from cosmology, is the same space that divides religious concepts from political, racial, gender, or national concepts, right? In fact, any perception of conceptual difference in areas of academic, scientific, or spiritual study dissolve the closer you approach the spatial boundaries that seem to divide them. This spatial defense is so important to our collective identities that we have instituted roles for individuals to play locally and nationally as defenders of this perceived space, so we can be eased of the burden of having to protect the boundaries of identity we have accumulated. Well, before I get too off track, let's imagine that the physical descriptions of the phenomenon of both gravity and magnetism can be correlated to a distinct aspect of human consciousness, for these descriptions in no objective way arose from some thinking, feeling person like you and I. Together, a part of everything. Separate, apart, is everything. Together, we separate parts, we things, separate in the space that makes the things as parts apart from everything. Help me, please. I'm looking for nothing. You see, I've lost nothing. I've placed reward signs for nothing throughout the neighborhood. Why do we believe in nothing? Everything and everything, this and that, mine and yours, between theirs and ours, his and hers, both tombs and places of worship. Categories are catacombs, severed space into corridors for consciousness to roam. And the space, torn between everything and everything, is the place where an individual's consciousness was born. Individuals, indivisive vigils. Cosmologically speaking, gravity is said to be determined by the relationship between an object's mass and the density within the volume of its mass. Generally, the greater the density of an object, the greater its gravitational field. So the more matter or mass you can fit into the same amount of space, the denser it is and the greater its gravitational field. That is, if we're talking about the same type of matter. But again, let's keep this simple for now. Planetary gravity is also related to mass. For instance, the density of Jupiter is only 1/4 that of Earth, but its mass is 318 times that of our own planet. This is because our planet is made of metals and minerals and liquid water, whereas Jupiter is made from less dense gases. In this case, because the mass of Jupiter is so much greater than that of Earth, its mass contributes to its gravity, yet only so much as to make its gravity roughly 2.5 times that of our much smaller planet. So what this says is that the greater the density of an object relative to its mass, the greater its gravitational pull on other objects relative to it in space. And remember, density is measured by volume, and volume, spatially, is always cubed. Now, let's look at the different ways in which we are stuck.
3 years now and no meat.
We're all fixed in our ways to some greater or lesser extent. The fixed nature of our beliefs represents the density of our identities. And like planetary bodies, the greater our density, the greater our personal gravity that holds the mass of our identity together. Thus, the more fixed we are in our identity, the more dense we are said to be. Also, the relationships that we form and gravitate towards are a reflection of this gravity that pulls others into orbit around us and us into orbit around other mass identities of similar density. Birds of a feather, right? So now, let's imagine we can isolate the individual components of this complex dynamic we call identity. Let's say I'm a liberal Democrat, a Buddhist, a vegan, an environmental activist, and a feminist. They all seem like quite possible combinations of identities that might fit together cohesively, right? And then my brother happens to be a conservative Republican, Christian omnivore who doesn't believe in a woman's right to govern her own body. Another well-joined combination of traits. Now these may be ideological polarities, but they are by no means unconceivable. Each of these people in this hypothetical scenario contain ideological boundaries, spaces that divide them from each other by excluding that which is in opposition to them, and each of them defends the meaning of their beliefs that in turn helps to reinforce the spatial boundaries of ideology that supports the infrastructure of their individual identities and the larger network of relationships they orbit. Okay, so far we have one aspect of personal conscious identity that becomes fixed in a self-concept or self-ideation within a larger system that is our complete notion of self and worldview, and herein we form gravitational bonds of shared orbits with others of compatible mass and density. Mass here not referring to physical matter, but rather what matters to us. Our fixed nature has a type of gravity that holds our ideas of ourself and our worldview together. What I mean to say is gravity as we know it in planetary bodies is synonymous with the density of our personal identities. The material or mass of one unit of self-ideation is the meaning inherent within the volume of space one idea of ourself contains. Each self-concept contains a mass of meaning, what matters to us, right? This is within a volume of space that divides it from other self-concepts that collectively form the whole of our personal identity. The meaning of our self-concept is contained within a conceptually isolated space that defines it. This spatial definition that houses one notion of self has a limited volume. And remember, volume is a cubed measurement. The volume of one self-concept is the inner spatial limits that define how much acceptance is available to the amount of self confined and isolated within it. Also, the more restrictive the volume, or the more meaning that can be crammed into it, the denser and more fixed it becomes. Hence, the denser its mass, the greater its gravity that holds it together and draws us into orbit around certain experiences. But what is the actual gravitational field of self-identity? Well, the gravitational field that holds the self together is desire. But before it became desire as we know it, this field of elemental energy originated as a primordial longing for unconditional fulfillment. Its origins, inseparable from our own, are covered in a later discussion. So, to continue, desire is the name given to the primary element in consciousness that becomes tuned or attuned, if you will, to the meaning inherent within the volume of one unit of self-identity. In other words, as an elemental vibrational force, desire is the energetic medium that holds the mass of meaning of identity together. For instance, all of the attributes we describe ourselves with are inscribed as meaning upon energy housed within the spatial boundaries within one self-concept as well as within one thought. Desire's vibration is imprinted and retuned to carry on its waves the information of our identity. Herein, mass or meaning within one self-concept is the amount of information stored upon the waves of desire. Hence, the more meaning that can be imprinted upon these waves, the more mass that is contained within the volume of one identity. Now, within one notion of self, as within one thought, is the vibration of desire that holds the mass and material of meaning together within the limited volume of that self-concept. Herein, the meaning is the mass of identity held within a specific volume that helps to determine the density of the meaning and therefore the frequency and the strength of gravity that holds it all together. The conflicts that arise within us are due to the spatial boundaries within ourselves and are only one step away from manifesting as conflicts imposed on others we perceive as outside of ourself. In other words, the conflicts that arise within us over the internal space that defines one aspect of ourself from another aspect of ourself is the same space that defines the acceptance of others outside ourself. It is, after all, this empty space, empty of love, imbued with conditions, that divides all things conceptually and benefits from the suffering such division demands. The perception of spatial differences within our mind and outside in the world, the multitudes of identities within us and outside of us, and the components within one concept of identity, in total, form the infrastructure of consciousness. As it is, the whole of our personal identity was formed by the same infrastructure of consciousness that formed all other people on this planet. And so the whole of our personal identity, formed from a collective infrastructure, fits functionally, though with necessary inherent conflict, within the collective consciousness of humanity. The difference of ourselves from others and the groups we identify with is defined by the same spatial boundaries that define one self-concept from another within us. This space is the antithetical force.